Dawn broke cold and colorless over the camp on April 17, 1945, at the edge of the Harz Mountains, where mist clung to the barracks like a second skin and the last echoes of distant artillery rolled through the valleys. American armored jeeps rumbled through the front gate just after 0700 hours, their engines coughing in the morning chill, tires crushing frost-stiffened gravel as the first squad of the 9th Armored Division advanced with rifles at the ready. They expected chaos, doors flying open, prisoners surging forward, a desperate rush toward freedom. Instead, they found hundreds of German women standing motionless behind the barbed wire, watching silently, their breath drifting upward like faint ghosts in the cold air. The U.S. soldiers hesitated, stunned by the scene. These women, auxiliary clerks, radio operators, nurses, and factory workers captured in the frantic retreats of late March, did not react the way liberated prisoners usually did. Lieutenant Warren Hale, who had helped clear 2 camps earlier that week, muttered to his sergeant that something felt wrongly rehearsed, as if the captives were waiting for a cue that no one had given. Even when the Americans swung the gate wide and shouted through interpreters that the war for them was over, not a single woman stepped forward. They simply stared, unmoving, tense as drawn wire. Wind swept across the compound, rustling the uniforms. They had been given by their own guards in the final days, tattered Wehrmacht coats, faded auxiliary jackets, mismatched shoes. Some women clutched small satchels, others held nothing at all. A few had bandages wrapped around their hands or foreheads from the collapsing German infrastructure they had been trapped in. The Americans could sense fear rolling off them, but it wasn't directed at their liberators. It was something deeper, shaped by months of propaganda and the disintegration of the Reich. Stories had circulated among civilians and auxiliaries that capture by Americans meant torture or disappearance. Those whispered terrors clung like chains far heavier than the rusted locks on the camp gates. From the watchtower, a lonely seagull cried, oddly out of place this far inland, and the sound rippled through the prisoners. Yet even then, they didn't move. Some lowered their eyes, others tightened their grip on their small bundles, but all remained frozen in their rows. Captain Raymond Holt signaled his men to step back, letting the women see the rifles lower and the immediate threat dissolve. But still the prisoners remained rooted to the ground, refusing the freedom now literally at their feet. As the Americans advanced deeper into the camp, they noticed the signs of recent German abandonment. The guard shacks were empty, coffee still half warm in tin mugs. Footlockers lay overturned as if someone had fled within minutes of hearing the American approach. A half-burned stack of documents smoldered near the command barracks, standard procedure for German units retreating under pressure. Somewhere in that pile had likely been rosters, interrogation notes, and inventories. Everything the last guards didn't want their captors to read. Yet the women had been left behind, with nothing but their own fear and the weight of collapsing. Loyalty to a government that had never truly protected them. The Americans attempted to coax them forward again, this time with a German-speaking corporal from Wisconsin whose family roots traced back to Bremen. His voice was steady, even gentle, telling the women that they were free citizens now, not prisoners. But the conditioning ran too deep. Many of these women had been raised on wartime directives declaring that surrender was dishonorable, especially for those who had supported the military machine administratively or medically. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels had flooded the nation with speeches promising destruction for those who failed in duty or showed weakness. Those words, imprinted across years of conflict, echoed now in the camp far louder than the American engines. One woman finally spoke, a tall, hollow-cheeked former signal operator. Her voice trembled as she explained that if they stepped forward without explicit orders, they might be shot. Not by Americans, but by some unseen German authority they still imagined lurking beyond the horizon, capable of returning at any moment. It was as if the Reich still cast a long shadow, even though its armies were collapsing in every direction. The Americans exchanged glances. The psychology of fear here was so complete it had survived the physical defeat of its creators. By midday the sun pierced the fog, revealing the full scale of the camp. Roughly 1,500 women arranged in silent formations. Engineers from the 16th Armored Engineers assessed the fences, noting the craftsmanship of the original layout. much of it assembled by forced labor in late 1944 when the German war machine was fracturing and improvising. The Americans cut auxiliary wires and inspected the gate mechanisms, ensuring no hidden dangers remained. Yet the symbolic barrier mattered more than the physical one. The women still refused to cross it, even when the path lay open and cleared. The deeper the soldiers searched for answers, the clearer a pattern emerged. For many of these women, stepping out meant acknowledging not just defeat but identity rupture. They were auxiliaries to a fading empire, trained to believe allegiance outweighed personal safety. To move toward the Americans without command authorization violated the very discipline drilled into them by months of instruction in communication. Schools, medical academies, and clerical camps scattered across the Reich. Freedom, to them, looked less like salvation and more like betrayal. As rations were brought in, K-ration biscuits, canned meat, coffee that steamed into the cold air. The women accepted them cautiously, still inside the wire. American medics moved in, checking minor injuries, offering blankets, and trying to build trust. They discovered malnutrition, untreated infections, and exhaustion that ran far deeper than any one battle could explain. The women had lived through years of bombing raids, factory shifts, scarcity, and relocations as Germany rerouted production deeper inland. Their stoic stance was partially physical, partially psychological. A final act of endurance shaped by a system that demanded unending obedience. Late in the afternoon, a murmur spread through the ranks. A few women stepped closer to the American soldiers, curiosity edging out fear. But they still didn't cross the threshold. Sergeant Hale watched, realizing that liberation was not a moment. It was a process, a slow untangling of everything they had been taught to believe. The Germans had opened the gates for years to enlist them into service, to call them cogs in a vast military machine. Now the Americans had opened a different kind of gate, one that required the courage to abandon an identity built on hierarchy and dread. And as night approached, the women remained in place, caught between the world that had collapsed and the world waiting for them outside the wire. What finally pushed them forward would not be force, nor hunger, nor the presence of foreign soldiers. It would be a hidden factor the Americans had not yet revealed, a quiet advantage that would break through fear itself. That moment, shocking, unexpected, and profoundly human, would define everything that followed. The breakthrough began the next morning, long before the sun cleared the tree-line. Fog drifted like low smoke across the camp, and the women still stood in their rigid clusters, eyes fixed on the open gate they could not bring themselves to cross. What they didn't know, what no one had explained yet, was that the Americans had brought with them a quiet, unseen advantage designed for situations exactly like this. It was not a weapon, nor a psychological tactic, nor any form of pressure. It was something far more human, engineered not on battlefields but in hospitals, training academies, and universities across the United States. It arrived in the form of a single truck marked with a red cross that rolled into the compound at 0735 hours. Inside were 4 women. They were members of the U.S. Army Nurse Corps and the Women's Army Corps, WWIIs, trained under programs shaped by pioneers like Colonel Oveta Kulpabi and supported by medical instructors who had spent 3 years refining humane POW protocols. Their arrival was not random. American psychological officers had learned through months of interrogations, decoded German communications, and civilian encounters that fear-driven paralysis, especially among auxiliary personnel, could only be broken by something familiar, the presence of other women in uniform. Engineers at Fort Knox, medical officers at Walter Reed, and analysts from the Office of War Information had contributed to internal memoranda explaining how gender could influence surrender behavior, especially among groups conditioned to expect brutality from occupying forces. When the 4 American women stepped from the truck, their boots sinking slightly into the dew-soaked ground, a ripple passed through the German prisoners. It wasn't excitement, more like disbelief. One former Luftwaffe clerk whispered to her friend, wondering aloud how it was possible that women served alongside U.S. soldiers so openly. For years, Nazi policies had limited women to auxiliaries strictly controlled by male officers. The concept of trained female personnel operating freely within an army felt impossible, but the WSCs moved without hesitation. Their demeanor was calm, restrained, and professional. No shouted orders, no intimidating gestures. They carried medical kits, blankets, and neatly folded papers, translated assurances of safety, written by Army linguists drawing from Geneva Convention guidelines and distributed through POW transition protocols refined since late 1943. The women spoke slowly and directly, explaining how the next steps of processing, relocation, and medical screening would work. They addressed the German prisoners not as enemies, but as individuals who had endured hardship. That was the hidden advantage, not firepower, not numbers. Human structure. The Americans had built an entire system, engineered by psychologists, logisticians, and field officers, that recognized fear, treated it, and dismantled it piece by piece. The breakthrough didn't happen all at once. It began with a single German woman, a nurse from Königsberg, who stepped forward to ask a question in trembling English. A WAC medic answered her gently, explaining that no one would be shot for leaving the wire. No one would be punished for speaking, or moving, or choosing to walk toward the Americans. The German nurse swallowed hard, took 3 hesitant steps, and crossed the invisible barrier she had feared for so long. That was the ignition. Others followed, first in 1s and 2s, then in small groups. The Americans kept distance, following guidance from a mid-war training circular that discouraged crowding former enemy auxiliaries during first contact scenarios. They let the women approach at their own pace, offering blankets, food, and water as needed. The prisoners' confusion mixed with relief. Their rigid formations dissolved into loose lines. Yet even as trust grew, another mystery hovered over the camp. The reason the German women had surrendered in the first place. Their capture weeks earlier had not been a battle in the traditional sense. It had been a collapse. During the chaotic retreat across the Rhine, these women had been abandoned as rear units dissolved. Many had tried to evacuate with retreating columns, but were forced into makeshift camps by local commanders who no longer had transport, fuel, or even clear communication with higher headquarters. Orders contradicting previous orders had piled in from failing command networks. What reached them last was a chilling directive whispered between clerks: stay put, keep formation, and do not act independently, even if overrun. That psychological cage had remained locked long after the physical one opened. But now, for the first time, the Americans understood how to dismantle it fully. Late that morning, the decisive turning point came during a formal announcement delivered by Captain Holt and translated line by the WACs. He explained that all the women would be transported to a processing station where they would receive medical treatment, proper food, and temporary housing. He read from a document drafted by U.S. Army Civil Affairs officers, an outline of rights, protections, and post-war procedures. The text referenced earlier humanitarian operations in France, Italy, and Belgium, grounding its promises in precedents that the Germans had, until now, known only through rumor. The words didn't merely inform. They transformed. One of the senior German auxiliaries, a former staff sergeant responsible for communications, asked to inspect the paper herself. She read each line, tracing her finger across the translated clauses. Slowly, she nodded. Her voice carried across the courtyard as she declared that the Americans were honoring structure, not dissolving it. In a world collapsing around them, she had found a thread of order she could trust. By early afternoon, the camp underwent a remarkable shift. The women began preparing their belongings. Some arranged their satchels with military precision, recalling the routines drilled into them in their respective service branches. Others helped the wounded or comforted friends who still trembled. For the first time since liberation, the compound felt alive, not with fear, but with hesitant purpose. Then came the moment that defined the day. A convoy of transport trucks backed into the camp, engines humming, sunlight glinting off their steel frames. The women looked at them with mixed awe and uncertainty. These vehicles were not symbols of captivity, but transition. American mechanics, trained under Detroit factory engineers who had retooled assembly lines to maintain wartime consistency, had kept these transports running despite months of nonstop operations. Their reliability now served a new mission, rebuilding shattered lives. One by one, the German women approached the loading area. The same gate they had refused to cross less than a day earlier now stood behind them. Many glanced back at it, realizing how small it looked from this side. Others stepped forward without hesitation, carrying bundles that contained little more than a few documents, worn shoes, or a keepsake hidden through months of turmoil, but not all boarded. Near the back of the line, a small group hesitated, young women barely out of their teens, still trapped between fear and uncertainty. A WSE medic approached them quietly, speaking in soft German learned from her immigrant grandmother. Whatever she said made one of the girls nod, swallow hard, and climb aboard. The rest followed. By 1,700 hours, the camp was nearly empty. Only the wind remained, carrying with it the faint echo of a world that had demanded obedience through fear. The Americans had broken that fear not with force, but with what the Germans least expected: compassion supported by structure, organization built by engineers and psychologists, and a system designed to restore humanity even in the final days of war. In the days that followed, the transformation that began at the camp rippled far beyond its barbed wire perimeter. When the trucks carrying the German prisoners rolled westward toward the temporary processing centers near Kassel and Marburg, the women inside sat in tense quiet, absorbing the staggering reality that they were no longer part of the collapsing Reich. Forests flashed past the canvas-covered openings. Villages lay silent with bomb-cratered roofs, and the roads shook beneath the weight of retreating armies and advancing supply convoys. Yet inside those trucks, something subtler was occurring. Layers of fear, deep, conditioned, institutional fear, began to peel away. The Americans had not shouted, beaten, or threatened. They had rebuilt order where the Reich's system had dissolved into chaos. Upon arrival at the processing stations, the women encountered the next phase of the American advantage: scale. Rows of medical tents stretched like a white field across muddy ground, each staffed by doctors, nurses, and technicians whose training was rooted in pre-war public health programs, Red Cross protocols, and the wartime expansions of institutions like Walter Reed and Fort Sam Houston. The systematic rhythm, registration, medical checks, decontamination, meal distribution, was the kind of order the Germans recognized, but without the punishment-driven harshness they expected. Technicians recorded temperatures with quick, precise movements. Nurses instructed them on hygiene procedures designed by military sanitation engineers who had studied disease outbreaks in North Africa and Sicily. Food was measured, rationed, and delivered with exactness. A system crafted from logistics models that Detroit mathematicians and Quartermaster Corps officers had refined to keep millions of troops fed from Normandy to the Philippines. The German women. It felt impossible. 2 days earlier, they had believed stepping outside a gate without orders would get them killed. Now they were watching American discipline function at a level they had never been taught to expect from an enemy. Even the tone shocked them. No insults, no retribution, just process, predictable, almost calm. This psychological shift deepened when the interrogations began. They were not the harsh interrogations some had feared. Instead, intelligence officers asked structured questions, cross-referencing communication logs, service records, and personal accounts. Many of these officers had been trained under systems shaped by émigré scholars who had fled Europe in the 1930s, linguists, sociologists, and political scientists whose insights into authoritarian behavior shaped American understanding of how the Reich controlled its population. The women learned, sometimes with shame, sometimes with relief, that the Americans already knew far more about the structure of German auxiliary units than their own officers had admitted in private moments between interviews. The women confessed quietly to one another that they were surprised the Americans acknowledged their exhaustion. The Reich had never celebrated their service beyond propaganda speeches. Their contributions in radio rooms, field hospitals, and administrative offices had been treated as duty, not sacrifice. Yet here, medics praised the strength required to survive through shortages, bombardments, and forced relocations. For the first time, some felt seen as individuals rather than components in a machine. News traveled fast among them. Some heard from village civilians that the Allies had opened food distribution points. Others learned that factory workers, men and women alike, were being issued documents for future labor programs. The specter that had kept them frozen behind the wire began to fade. The old world that had demanded obedience at all costs was truly gone. In the weeks that followed, Psychological evaluations showed a pattern that American analysts documented carefully. Many of the German women had not refused freedom out of loyalty to the Reich, but because they had lost the ability to trust any authority at all. Their entire reality had been built on rigid hierarchy. When it collapsed, it left them stranded between fear and emptiness. The Americans, through predictable routines and consistent behavior, inadvertently handed them a bridge across that chasm. This finding would later be reported in internal assessments that contributed to early Cold War research on civilian morale, occupation strategy, and democratic transitions. But the impact didn't end with the war's close. For many of these women, the experience reshaped the rest of their lives. Some later served as translators for Allied occupation units, choosing structure over uncertainty. Others became nurses or clerks in reconstruction offices, drawn to the same organizational clarity that had once frightened them. A few wrote memoirs decades later, recalling the day the Americans opened the gate and they could not move, not because they lacked courage, but because fear had become a kind of second skin. Their words echoed the assessments made by U.S. Army psychologists who noted that liberation required more than removing fences. It required removing the internalized voice of a collapsing regime. American occupation strategy evolved with cases like theirs. Civil affairs units recognized that fear could be dissolved not merely through power, but through predictability, a principle later incorporated into operations in Korea, Vietnam, and the Balkans. The techniques engineers and logisticians had built for managing vast troop movements were now applied to rebuilding societies, record-keeping systems, food distribution networks, medical protocols, and transportation scheduling. What had once moved armies now moved shattered communities toward stability, but there was another legacy, more personal, more enduring. The presence of American women in uniform had planted a seed many of the German prisoners carried home after release. They had witnessed a model of service radically different from what the Reich allowed. Women operating radios for frontline units, commanding medical teams, and directing logistics. This had been unimaginable under Nazi ideology. Yet they had seen it firsthand. For some, it quietly influenced post-war careers. For others, it shifted their view of what roles women could claim in a society no longer shaped by authoritarian limits. Years later, in oral histories recorded by European universities, several former prisoners recalled that their first sense of a different future had come not from speeches, but from seeing 4 American women step out of a truck with steady hands and steady eyes. When the last of the former POW women departed the processing centers months later, many looked back one final time. Not at barbed wire. There was none here, but at the rows of tents, motor pools, medical stations, and administrative offices that had rebuilt their understanding of order itself. They had entered those gates as shadows of a broken empire. They left as individuals once again, learning how to breathe without fear. Years later, when asked how liberation had felt, one former auxiliary said the most unexpected truth. It didn't feel like freedom at first. It felt like stepping into sunlight after too long in darkness. You blink, you hesitate, but eventually, your eyes adjust. The Americans had opened the gate, but the women walked through it only when the world on the other side felt like something more than the absence of captivity. It felt like the beginning of a life not defined by orders shouted in collapsing corridors, but by the quiet rebuilding of humanity. Slow, deliberate, and real. In the end, liberation was not a moment. It was a passage, and for those women, it began the instant they realized the Americans had brought not judgment, but a system strong enough to steady them as they stepped into the unknown. Like, share, and subscribe for more World War II stories.